guys, I am Thomas Whitaker, and I will be presenting today on Buddhism and Kierkegaard's existentialism and how the two relate. So for a little background on why I picked this topic, a year ago in the spring of 2020, I was studying abroad at the University of Copenhagen, and that is where Soren Kierkegaard is from and where he attended school in Denmark, Copenhagen. 179 years before me, so I got to take classes at the same university. They gave him his philosophy degree, and it was all just very nice. And I took a class on his writings, and it really gave me a greater appreciation for his work as a whole. Sadly, this was cut short due to COVID about a year ago, but, life goes on. It was still fun. Who was Soren Kierkegaard anyways? He was a Danish philosopher who studied Hegel extensively. He is often considered the father of existentialism, especially for coining the term of existential angst, which is the anxiety that comes with existence and having to make choices. Notably, he was a Christian existentialist, but not in the same way that he was a devout church man, but more of a personal faith with God. And he coined the term the leap of faith, where one must put one's faith in God despite the fact that God is beyond our understanding in many ways and may appear absurd. He inherited wealth from his father to fund his writings until he died in his 40s, and he was a prolific writer who wrote under pseudonyms, sometimes using multiple pseudonyms in a single book, and the pseudonyms would talk to each other and engage in a dialogue, but it was all him, and he's a really interesting writer. But we're talking about how he relates to Buddhism, so we're going to do a little quick refresher on Buddhism and the Four Noble Truths. The first is that our primary existential malady is suffering. The second is that suffering arises from desire, aversion, and a fundamental ignorance as to the nature of reality, that nature being impermanence. The third is that the realization that the substantial self is an illusion leads to the extinction of desire and aversion that fuels suffering. And the fourth noble truth is that is a path that presents a therapeutic regimen involving morality, meditation, and the cultivation of wisdom, aka Buddhism. So, how do Kierkegaard and Buddhism relate? Both of them propose a rejection of a substantialist view of the self as a simple static substance. Neither of them will believe that or buy into it. And the Madhyamaka thinkers and Kierkegaard's Anticlimacus from his Sickness unto Death text offer an account of the self based in emptiness. Okay, so let's talk about the rejection of a substantialist self. In Indian Buddhism, rejection is a rejection of a substantialist notion of the self called Atman from the Upanishads, which is an ancient Hindu text predating Buddhism. The Four Noble Truths, which we already read, pretty clearly reject this substantialist notion, and the Abhidharma literature, which comes from India after, in the Common Era, offer a reductionist view. And that is that the self is a composite of 5 aggregates that are impermanent and always changing. There are the 5 aggregates. One is the body, and the rest are mental. But there is no substantial self, despite the body being a composite of these aggregates, because they are impermanent and always changing. Okay, so now I'm going to read this quote from Sickness unto Death, and it's kind of the main quote in his thesis, but it is confusing, but we're going to explain it after. So, okay. The human being is a spirit, but what is spirit? Spirit is the self. But what is the self? The self is a relation which relates to itself, or that in the relation which is its relating to itself. The self is not the relation, but the relations relating to itself. A human being is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, a synthesis. A synthesis is a relation between 2 terms. Looked at in this way, a human being is not yet a self. In a relation between 2 things, the relation is the third term, and the relation is the third term in the form of a negative unity, and the 2 relate to the relation, and in the relation to that relation. This is what is from the point of view of the soul, for soul and body to be in relation. If, on the other hand, the relation relates to itself, then this relation is the positive third, and this is the self. What does that even mean? Well, let me tell you. So, as we know, Kierkegaard very thoroughly studied the Hegelian dialectic, which is where a thesis and antithesis crash together, form a synthesis. That synthesis becomes the thesis, and then another antithesis arises from that new synthesis, and boom, another synthesis. So the self is both the product of synthesis and the action of synthesizing. Kierkegaard believes that the self is something that needs to be built up. So it is not only the product of it, but also the action of doing it is the self. And you might be wondering, how can the self be a process of producing and also the product? And Anticlimacus explains that the self is paradoxical in nature as the synthesis of temporal and eternal, of finite and infinite, and so on and so on. So it is sort of inherent to its nature, according to Kierkegaard. And modern Kierkegaard scholars further explain that this paradox is simply the nature of living, and that it doesn't need to rely on some sort of substance, like a Cartesian soul, in order to explain it. Like, that doesn't solve the issues. Like, this is a fact of life, according to Kierkegaard and his scholars. And how does God relate to all this? As a Christian, the task or action that is the self is not autonomous, but a relation that exists through God to an extent, because he constitutes the self and the process and all that. So you can't have it without God. Okay. So Kierkegaard's self and Buddhist illusion. Kierkegaard believes there are two methods of despair: wanting to get rid of the self or not be a self, or wanting in defiant despair to be itself, independent of God. But you can't do that because the self is grounded in the power that constituted the self, aka God. So you need to have faith in God in order to truly be a self, or a higher power, not necessarily God. Okay. So Kierkegaard and Buddhist suffering. Both philosophies' self-suffering comes from a belief in an illusion, even though the illusions are different. And both understand the self in terms of change. However, the Buddhist self is constantly changing, and the Kierkegaard self is constantly changing in a building up way. So it has sort of a past and present, as opposed to just a present. There's a lot of opposition between the ideologies. Anticlimacus affirms what Buddhism would see as an illusion of the self and building up the self. Kierkegaard would reject a reductionist view, the five aggregates, and Anticlimacus believes in a building up of the self as a spiritual practice, not a composite of ever-changing aggregates. Okay, from a reductionist view of the self to an empty self. Mahayana Buddhism's idea of sunyata, or emptiness, creates a framework for criticizing the reductionist view, and it extends the idea of no self, or emptiness, to everything that exists, stating that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence. The only way for anything to exist at all is interdependently with all things. They do not exist with independence, but rather with interdependence. And here is a quote on that from a current philosopher in this field, a Mahayana Buddhism scholar. And thus the self, dependent on the aggregates, the elements, and the senses as they are in everyday life, is thought of as the appropriator of the same. These are the objects appropriated, and the self is their appropriator. And the self is not a real existent thing, and thus it is not constant, for it has no birth or ending. Attributes like permanence do not apply to it, and is not, nor is it other than, the aggregates. The self is not the aggregates, it is the appropriator of them, through emptiness, and so the self is not other in relation to those aggregates. And this mirrors Anticlimacus in the thought of the self as a synthesis, rather as an appropriation through this action. Okay. So a performativist theory of the self. This is popularized by Jonardon Ganeri, who is a philosophy professor at University of Toronto and does guest lectures all across the world on Eastern philosophy. And he, in this performativist theory of the self, or PTS, says that the self is not reducible to aggregates. The self is not separate or distinct from aggregates. the self appropriates these aggregates. He even quotes Kierkegaard to explain PTS. The truth is an objective of certainty held fast through appropriation with the most passionate inwardness. And that's from his concluding unscientific postscript. For PTS, the self is Anticlimacus's relations relating to itself as a performative activity wherein I lay claim to the continuing synthesis of the infinite and the finite, the temporal and the eternal, and the freedom and necessity. PTS offers a synthesis between Kierkegaard's self and Buddhist self, a self that is in the process of constructing itself through appropriation and synthesis. Also, for this quote, that is from Ganeri. I forgot to attribute it to him, but that is his version of like the appropriation as an action, which mirrors Kierkegaard's the self is the synthesis of itself. So, yeah. In conclusion, I would just say that some Western philosophers and thinkers, like Kierkegaard, can produce an interesting dialogue when paired with Buddhist ideas, and one can see the similarities, the differences, and how their different cultures influence their writings. What other Western philosophers do you guys think could interact with Buddhism in a similar way to Kierkegaard, or in a different way, or in a better way, or do you have any sort of thoughts on that? If not, you can feel free to ask any questions, and I will try my best to answer them. Thank you very much. And here are the citations for the presentation. Thank you.